Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to another episode of Rednecks Rising. Today is the last episode of August 2022, which has inspired me to do a little bit of a Labor Day history deep dive, if you will. It's less of an Appalachian focus than most of my normal content, but I still think y'all will enjoy it, and it is definitely interconnected with the other Appalachian history that we've talked about so far and will talk about in the episodes to come. If you're new here, Rednecks Rising is an Appalachian liberation podcast where we bust the myths about Appalachian history and the stereotypes about our hell-raising neighbors that live in these hollers today. This podcast is independently produced by yours truly, which means that it is brought to you by doom scrolling, excessive amounts of chicken quesadillas, and trashy reality TV. Most importantly, though, the podcast is made possible by our amazing supporters of all different shapes and sizes. We have a stellar crew of followers on social media who hype up our killer memes and lift up the show on their own personal pages, which helps spread the word about the pod and gain new listeners and makes a huge difference, honestly. We also have a phenomenal gaggle of little baby ducklings who support the podcast financially over on our Ko-Fi page, which is pretty similar to a Patreon. We've got folks who have made a commitment to throw anywhere from $1 to $10 towards the podcast each month, which helps us keep this show running. And we've also got folks who have thrown a few bucks to us on a one-time basis. And we've got folks who have bought some of our sick merch, which means they're contributing financially as well as spreading the word by wearing that merch. If you want to support us in whatever way works for you, you can find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where you can follow us and share us, and you can throw a few bones our way by visiting KO, like knockout, -fi.com/Rednecks Rising. Just like it's spelled in the title of the podcast, no capital letters, no spaces, no special characters. And last but certainly not least, you can show your support by subscribing to the pod wherever you are currently listening to this episode, and make sure to leave us a rating or a review if you have that option, and that way you help other listeners find us and let them know that we're pretty legit. Speaking of merch, we have a few new merch items in the shop that I am so freaking excited about. Specifically, a couple of different ball caps that I think y'all are going to like. There's 3 different ones. One says anti-capitalist in Appalachian. One says anti-racist in Appalachian. And the other says anti-fascist in Appalachian. So you get your pick of the litter. And all 3 come in, I believe, 4 different color choices, if I'm remembering correctly. So y'all go take a look at those when you get a chance. And shout out to Sierra, my girl, who I interviewed in the episode called This Land Is Not Your Land. And shout out to her because she was the first person to hop on and buy a hat before I feel like I really even had a solid chance to announce it. So that level of enthusiasm is really where I strive to be in all areas of my life. And I'll be giving away one of those hats in the upcoming September giveaway that I've been teasing. I'll be announcing the terms and conditions, quote unquote, of the giveaway in next week's episode, where I am also interviewing a super exciting guest, so stay tuned. Also, I should mention that half the profits from the money that this podcast receives go towards supporting Appalachian folks who do good work on the ground, whether that work is in mutual aid, like our first round of contributions that went to the Pulaski County Free Store. Shout out, they also just became an official 501c3, so congratulations, my friends. Or whether that money goes towards something like abortion access or something else entirely. So I haven't decided where we are going to send the profits from August and September yet, but I'll probably announce that next week as well. So next week, all in all, we will have important announcements related to how you can win a sweet hat from the September giveaway, where the profits from August and September will be going to for supporting community work. And I am so freaking stoked to announce that I'll be interviewing Nelson from the one and only Dixieland of the Proletariat podcast. I know that a lot of y'all are already fans of their podcast, and in this super, very exclusive interview, we have a great convo that I think you'll really enjoy. So please tune in next week for those announcements in that awesome episode. And speaking of interviews, if you have someone that you want to hear me talk to on the show, don't hesitate to let me know, even if that person is yourself. You can reach out to me on social media, or you can email me at rednecksrising@gmail.com, also spelled the same way it is in the title, no spaces, no special characters, all one word. All right. Whew, that was a lot of talking, but I think that is all the chores that we needed to check off of our honey-do list for today. So that brings us to today's trivia question of the day.
Hey, Chelsea.
Howdy, Chris.
So, Appalachian culture is influenced by a lot of different cultures from around the world, with one in particular being the culture of African slaves that were brought into this area. One of the instruments that Appalachia is well known for originates from African culture. Do you know what that instrument is?
Oh, I actually think I do have a really great guess for this, only because of Sammy. And I don't want to ruin it for the listeners. So y'all will have to stick around till the end of the episode to find out for yourselves my guess and whether or not I am correct. All right, so as we start this episode together, as you know I love to do because ADHD, let's set the stage, shall we? To quote one of the articles that I was reading, the whole period of the late 1800s was fraught with conflict between working people and unions and the employers. The idea of class warfare, it was a literal term at the time. It was warfare. There was a lot of violence and conflict, end quote. A newspaper in North Carolina, where I happen to live, in August of 1855 reported on the hundreds of thousands of working class families existing upon half starvation from year to year. In the 30 years leading up to the Civil War, the laws of the United States were increasingly interpreted in the courts to suit the capitalist development of this country. To name just a few examples, mill owners were given the legal right to destroy other people's property by flood in order to carry on their business. The law of eminent domain was used to take farmers' land and give it to canal companies or railroad companies as subsidies. Judgments for damages against businessmen were taken out of the hands of juries, which were unpredictable, and given to judges to secure more control over the outcomes of those judgments. Private settlement of disputes by arbitration was replaced by court settlements, which meant there was a bigger dependence on lawyers, which meant there was a larger barrier for poor and working folks, and increased the importance of the legal profession, which Sierra and I already talked about all the barriers to entry surrounding that entire profession in that interview where I talked to her. And this ancient idea of a fair price for material goods was undermined in the courts to the idea of caveat emptor, which I guess means let the buyer beware, which just essentially threw generations of consumers from that time forward into the mercy of businessmen. All in all, this was a time when the law did not even pretend to protect everyday people, as it, I guess, kinda does today, even if that pretending today is very poor. Health and safety laws at the time were either non-existent or unenforced. In Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1860, there was a winter day where the Pemberton Mill collapsed and there were 900 workers inside, mostly women. Out of those 900 workers, 88 died Almost 10% died. And although there was evidence that the structure itself of that mill had never been adequate to support all the heavy machinery that was inside, and that this fact was known to the construction engineer, despite that fact, the jury found no evidence of criminal intent in the death of 88 workers. As one person said, by the middle of the 19th century, the legal system had been completely reshaped to the advantage of businessmen, men of commerce and industry at the expense of farmers, workers, consumers, and other less powerful groups within society. The legal system actively promoted a legal redistribution of wealth against the weakest groups in society. Weakest was the term used in the quote. I'd probably say like most vulnerable today. Then the Civil War came. And while I haven't really dug much into the Civil War yet in this podcast, there's just so much that goes into it, and there's so much pain surrounding the Civil War, and I'm not a history expert. That's not the background that I come from, and I just don't want to mess anything up. I would love to have someone on the show to talk about that, but it does deserve more attention. So we will definitely come back to it more in depth. And for now, it's important to know that during the Civil War, which was happening right around the same time period as hundreds of thousands of working class families were fighting for their very survival, during this time, over 100 million acres of land in what was being referred to as the Western Frontier were given by Congress and the president to various railroads free of charge. Congress also set up a national bank, putting the government into partnership with the banking interests, guaranteeing their profits. So strikes are spreading around this time in reaction to the horrible, abusive working conditions, and hundreds of thousands of workers were successfully organized into trade unions. And naturally, the employers, the big business dudes, start pressing Congress, and they're like, help us. Oh my gosh, the workers are getting so mad at us. And thus, the Contract Labor Law of 1864 made it possible for companies to sign contracts with foreign workers whenever the workers pledged to give 12 months of their wages to pay for the cost of immigration. This gave employers during the Civil War not only very cheap labor, but also a whole supply of strike breakers that could undermine attempts of labor organizers to disrupt production and improve working conditions. The contract law was intended from the start to discriminate against working people in favor of business interests. For example, the courts said if a worker signed a contract to work for a year and left before the year was up, so if he was injured on the job or went on strike or was terminated, left before the year was up, he was not entitled to any wages, even for the time he had worked. Let me just repeat that again. If a worker signed a contract to work for a year and left before the year was up, regardless of why he left, he was not entitled to any wages, even for the time that he had worked. The whole law was built on the idea that a worker and a railroad made a contract with equal bargaining power. And that made it possible for the judgments to be made, like one judgment from a Massachusetts judge who decided that an injured worker did not deserve compensation because by signing the contract, he had agreed to the risks involved. So the surviving soldiers of the Civil War returned home where they just found death traps of typhus, tuberculosis, hunger, fire. In New York, 100,000 people lived in the cellars of the slums. 12,000 women worked in prostitution houses to keep from starving. The garbage in New York was 2 feet deep in the streets, and it was alive with rats, people reported. In Philadelphia, while the rich were able to get their fresh water from the Schuylkill River. Did I say that right? Somebody please let me know how to pronounce that. Schuylkill River. Everyone else drank from the Delaware River, which was having 13 million gallons of sewage being dumped into it every day. At a mill in Providence, Rhode Island, fire broke out one night in 1866, and among the 600 workers, most of whom were women, a bunch jumped to their deaths from the upper story windows. Then, in the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, it was reported that the buildings fell so fast, one after another, that it sounded like an earthquake. And that was the fire where Mother Jones lost her home prior to diving in headfirst as a leader within the labor organizing efforts. All the while, these horrid living and working conditions were adding fuel to the fire of these workers' organizing efforts. Women were brought into the industry during the war, and so they were starting to organize unions of their own. Cigar makers, tailoresses, umbrella sewers, cap makers, printers, laundresses, shoe workers. All together, by 1864, about 200,000 workers, men and women, were in trade unions, forming national unions in some of the trades, putting out labor newspapers and doing all kinds of amazing work. And so, of course, troops were being used to break the strikes as the fear of the ruling class was growing in response to the building power of the working folks. Federal soldiers were sent to New York to end a strike at a gunworks shop where workers wanted a wage increase. Striking machinists and tailors in St. Louis were forced back to work by the Army. In Tennessee, a Union Army general arrested and sent out of the state 200 striking mechanics. When engineers on the Reading Railroad struck, troops broke that strike, as they did with other miners in Pennsylvania. And whatever laws were being passed under the premise of protecting the interests of workers were just basically lip service. I mean, we all know what this looks like. The Pennsylvania legislature in 1869 passed a Mine Safety Act, for example, which was supposed to provide for the regulation and ventilation of the mines and for the protection of the lives of the miners. But it would take more than 100 years of continuous accidents in those same mines for it to be understood just how insufficient those words were as anything other than just a means of calming the anger of these righteously indignant, suffering coal miners. Now, between the Civil War and 1900, steam and electricity replaced a lot of the work being done by human muscle. Iron replaced wood, steel replaced iron. Before the Civil War, it took 61 hours of labor to produce 1 acre of wheat. By 1900, it took 3 hours and 19 minutes. So at this point in time, steam had grown to drive textile mills, spindles, it drove sewing machines, and it came from coal. So in 1860, 14 million tons of coal were mined. By 1884, it was 100 million tons, so 14 to 100 million. More coal meant more steel because coal furnaces converted iron into steel. By 1910, 25 million tons. Immigrants would be brought in from Europe and China to contribute to the new labor force. And the farmers who were unable to afford the cost of all of this new machinery and the new rates of the railroads were charging would be pushed to move to the cities. And then you have the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, which was built with blood, sweat, politics, and thievery. And it all started with the meeting of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. So the Central Pacific Railroad started on the West Coast, and it was headed east. It spent $200,000 in Washington on bribes to get 9 million acres of free land and $24 million in bonds, and paid $79 million, which was overpaying by around $36 million to a construction company, which really actually belonged to the same company of the railroad. And this construction was done by 3,000 Irish and 10,000 Chinese folks over a period of 4 years, working for anywhere from $1 to $2 a day. And then the Union Pacific Railroad started in Nebraska, and it was headed west. It had been given 12 million acres of free land and around $27 million in government bonds. It created the Credit Mobilier Company and gave them $94 million for constructing the railroad when the actual cost was $44 million. So they were overpaying by, just a little $50 million. And meanwhile, shares in the Union Pacific Railroad were being sold cheaply to the congressmen at the time to buy them off, essentially, to prevent any investigation into these nefarious exchanges of currency. The construction of the Union Pacific Railroad required 20,000 workers, war veterans, and Irish immigrants who laid 5 miles of track a day and died by the hundreds in the heat, the cold, and the battles that they had to face with indigenous communities who were rightfully opposing this invasion on their territory. Both railroads used unnecessarily long, twisting routes in order to get subsidies from the towns that they went through. And in 1869, the two crooked railroad lines met in Utah, completing that first transcontinental railroad at a total cost that really is just incalculable. Within 4 years, in 1873, an economic crisis devastated the nation. It's almost like when we let the rich and powerful do whatever they want, regardless of whether or not it's actually in the best interest of all of us, that it turns out to be just, not so great for the economy too. Who would have thunk that, y'all? So this crisis of 1873 was built into a system which, by its very nature, was chaotic. This was a system in which the very rich were the only ones who were truly secure. It was a system of ongoing repeated crisis, 1837, 1857, 1873, and then to go on to 1893, 1907, 1919, 1929. Periodic crises that would wipe out small businesses and that would bring cold, hunger, and death to poor and working people, while the fortunes of the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans would keep growing through all 4 seasons of the cycle: war and peace, crisis and recovery. And during this crisis of 1873, Carnegie was capturing the steel market while Rockefeller was wiping out his competitors in oil naturally. And mass meetings and demonstrations of unemployed folks were taking place all over the country. In Chicago, 20,000 unemployed folks marched through the streets to the city hall to demand bread for the needy, clothing for the naked, and houses for the homeless. Strikes were being called in the textile mills of Massachusetts. In the anthracite coal district of Pennsylvania, there was the Long Strike, where Irish workers ended up being accused of acts of violence, mostly on the testimony of planted detectives among the miners. And remember, or I guess if this is the first episode that you're listening to, let's ground ourselves in a shared understanding that The entire purpose of bureaucratic institutions in the United States of America, our bodies of government, our law enforcement, our legal court proceedings, all of it, our education system, all of these bureaucratic institutions have been created with a shared purpose in mind. Settle upper class disputes peacefully, maintain systems of power, control poor and working folks, lower class rebellion, and adopt policies that further the long-range stability of this status quo, this system of chaos and crisis for the purpose of maintaining profit. We see this as being true from the beginning of the codification of race in the laws as early as the Virginia slave codes, which if you haven't listened to the episodes, please do. But those were written into law with the intention of suppressing multiracial organizing and uprising at the hands of indentured servants and purchased slaves. And it's certainly, this intention had not changed by the time of the events that we're talking about in today's episode. So let's remember and or ground ourselves in that shared understanding. So by 1877, the country was in the depths of the Depression. That summer, in the hot cities where poor families were living in cellars and drink-infested water, children were just becoming sick in huge numbers. Farmers and workers were beginning to rebel. There was a series of tumultuous strikes by railroad workers in a dozen cities that shook the nation as no labor conflict in its history had done in what we now call the Great Railroad Strikes. So at the Baltimore and Ohio station in Martinsburg, West Virginia, here we are with the Appalachia coming through. I told you I wasn't just going to totally deter from this path. But at this station, workers were determined to fight recent wage cuts that were taking place that were just downright egregious, like 10%, which is more than a cost of living raise nowadays. And they go on strike. They uncoupled the engines, ran them into the roadhouse, and announced that no more trains would be leaving Martinsburg until that 10% cut in wages was canceled. A crowd of support gathered, too many for the local police to disperse, and ultimately the Baltimore and Ohio station officials asked for the governor to send in military protection. And because our elected officials are basically always on the side of corporate elite for-profit politics, he then sent in militia troops. So a train tried to get through with protection from this militia, and there was a striker who was trying to derail it, who ended up exchanging gunfire with a militiaman who attempted to stop him, and the striker got shot in his thigh and his arm. His arm was amputated later that day, and 9 days later, he died. After his death, 600 freight trains jammed the yards at Martinsburg. The West Virginia governor then requested federal troops because the state militia was just not going to cut it. And quite frankly, they weren't even reliable, according to the governor at that point, because a ton of them were railroad workers who were sympathetic to the labor organizers. But since a lot of the U.S. Army at that point was tied up in killing indigenous folks in the land on the western areas of the country, J.P. Morgan, August Belmont, and other bankers had to offer to lend money to pay Army officers. And with the help of those bankers, federal troops then arrived in Martinsburg, and the freight cars began to move. Meanwhile, in Baltimore, a crowd of thousands of folks who were sympathetic to the railroad strikers surrounded the armory of the National Guard, which had been called out by the governor at the request of the B&O Railroad. The crowd hurled rocks, and the soldiers came out of the armory firing. The streets became the scene of a bloody battle, and by the time the evening was over, at least 10 people were dead. More were wounded, and half of the 120 troops quit, and the rest went on to the train depot. But they were not going to get out of there easily. No. There was a crowd of 200 waiting in the depot, where they smashed the engine of a passenger train, tore up the tracks, and engaged again in a run-in battle. By that point in time, 15,000 people surrounded the depot. 3 passenger cars, the station platform, and a locomotive were on fire. The governor again asked for federal troops, and the president finally responded. 500 soldiers arrived, and Baltimore quieted down. But despite the soldiers' ability to suppress action in Baltimore, the seeds of railroad rebellion had already begun to take root and were set to spread. Strikes were occurring almost every hour. The great state of Pennsylvania was in an uproar. New Jersey was afflicted by a paralyzing dread. New York was mustering an army of militia. Ohio was shaken from Lake Erie to the Ohio River. Indiana rested in a dreadful suspense. Illinois hung on the verge of a vortex of confusion and tumult. St. Louis was stuck in a state of shock from their own uprising. And in the midst of all the rebellion along the railroads during that summer of 1877, the Working Men's Party of Chicago called a rally. 6,000 people came and demanded nationalization of the railroads at that event, where a man by the name of Albert Parsons gave a fiery speech. Now, we're going to come back to Parsons here in a bit because he plays an important role in the story. And Parsons was from Alabama. He had fought in the Confederacy during the Civil War before going on to marry a brown-skinned woman who was apparently of Spanish and indigenous descent, and he worked as a typesetter and was reportedly one of the best English-speaking orators the Working Men's Party had. Now, the Working Men's Party had successfully led to the rebellion inside of the city of St. Louis, inside of flour mills, foundries, packing houses, machine shops, breweries, railroads, and on and on. There were perhaps 1,000 members of the Working Men's Party. Many of them were bakers, cabinet makers, cigar makers, brewery workers, and the party was organized into 4 sections based on nationality. And all 4 sections together took a ferry across the Mississippi to join a mass meeting of railroad men in East St. Louis, where the crowd heard a speaker urge them to organize. The speaker said, "All you have to do, gentlemen, for you to have the numbers, is to unite on one idea, that the working men shall rule the country. What man makes belongs to him, and the working men made this country." And the momentum of the crowds, the meetings, the enthusiasm couldn't be sustained though. And as they diminished, the police, militia, and federal troops moved in and the authorities took over. The police raided the headquarters of the Working Men's Party and arrested 70 people. The executive committee that had been, for a while, virtually in charge of the city, more or less, was in prison. The strikers were pushed to surrender. The wage cuts stayed in place, and 131 strike leaders were fired by the Burlington Railroad. By the time the Great Railroad Strikes of 1877 were over, 100 people were dead. 1,000 people had gone to jail. 100,000 workers had gone on strike, and the strikes had roused into action countless unemployed folks in cities across the nation. More than half the freight on the nation's 75,000 miles of railroad tracks had stopped running at the height of the strikes. That year, labor organizing taught many lessons to the corporate elite. They signaled their intentions moving into the rest of the century. They were going to take hold of the country from the north and the south, and they were going to organize the greatest increase of economic growth in human history. And they were going to do it with the aid of and at the expense of black labor, white labor, Chinese labor, European immigrant labor, women's labor, and they were going to reward all these workers differently by race, sex, national origin, and social class, specifically in order to create separate levels of oppression that would serve as the terraces, the steps for stabilizing the pyramid of wealth and power. In the 1880s and 1890s, immigrants were being brought in from Europe at a faster rate than ever before. They all went through the harrowing ocean voyage. And now, at this point, there weren't so many Irish and German immigrants as there were Italians and Russians and Jewish folks and Greek people from Southern and Eastern Europe. And there was a desperate competition among all of the newcomers to this land. By 1880, Chinese immigrants were being brought in by the railroads to do the back-breaking labor of constructing those tracks at pitiful wages while they became the objects of continuous violence. For example, in Wyoming in the summer of 1885, white folks attacked 500 Chinese miners and massacred 28 of them in cold blood. And these new immigrants were becoming house painters, stone cutters, ditch diggers. They were often being imported en masse by contractors. One Italian man, for example, was told that he was going to Connecticut to work on the railroad there and was taken instead to the sulfate mines in the South, where he and his co-workers were being watched over by armed guards in their barracks and in the mines. And they were only being given enough money to pay for their railroad fare and their tolls, and they were given very little to eat. There were 5.5 million immigrants in the 1880s and 4 million in the 1890s, and all of this created a huge labor surplus that served to keep wages down, which was the intention, right? It was all working exactly how it was intended to. These immigrants that were being brought in were more easily controlled by the corporate elite, more helpless than the native workers for the simple fact that they were culturally displaced. There were language barriers. And then the interests of the immigrants and the native workers who were searching for better conditions were seemingly at odds with one another. And all of these things made the immigrants incredibly useful to the corporate elite as strike breakers. Often the children worked, which intensified the problem of an oversized labor force and joblessness. In 1880, there were 1,100,000 children under 16, which is 1 out of every 6 children, were working in the United States. It was during this time, despite all the efforts to control and divide the masses at the hands of the ruling class, that great movements of workers and farmers were sweeping the country throughout the 1880s and 1890s. Movements that went beyond the scattered strikes and tenant struggles of the years leading up to 1877. These were nationwide movements, more threatening than before to the ruling class, more dangerously suggestive. It was a time when revolutionary organizations existed in major American cities, and revolutionary talk was in the air. And it was at this time in the 1880s that the movement for the 8-hour workday became a central demand of the labor movement nationwide, with Chicago acting as the center of that movement due to the strong presence of a vibrant anarchist movement in the city, organized around the International Working People's Association, aka the IWPA. The IWPA was based in the European immigrant community, and it published German newspapers in several languages, as well as it led the Central Labor Council, the CLC. The CLC was a body that the 11 largest unions in the city of Chicago were affiliated with. They came together via the CLC and passed resolutions calling for workers to arm themselves for self-defense. And in 1883, an anarchist congress took place in Pittsburgh, where they drew up a manifesto. This manifesto said, quote, "All laws are directed against the working people. Even the school serves only the purpose of furnishing the offspring of the wealthy with those qualities necessary to uphold their class domination. The children of the poor get scarcely a formal elementary training, and this too is mainly directed to such branches as tend to producing prejudices, arrogance, and servility. In short, want of sense. The church finally seeks to make complete idiots out of the mass and to make them forego the paradise on earth by promising a fictitious heaven. The capitalist press, on the other hand, takes care of the confusion of spirits in public life. The workers can therefore expect no help from any capitalistic party in their struggle against the existing system. They must achieve their liberation by their own efforts. As in former times, a privileged class never surrenders its tyranny. Neither can it be expected that the capitalists of this age will give up their rulership without being forced to do it." End quote. The manifesto asked for equal rights for all without distinction to sex or race. It quoted the Communist Manifesto. "Workmen of all lands, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a world to win." So that manifesto was drawn up in 1883, and starting in 1884, the labor movement was beginning to call for strikes and protests on May 1st to push for an 8-hour workday. So May 1st would become a holiday of International Workers' Day to be called May Day, which is now celebrated around the world, though weird, but not like weird ha-ha. It's not recognized in the United States. So this anarchist manifesto is drawn up in 1883 and 1884. The labor movement is calling for strikes related to an 8-hour workday. And by the spring of 1886, the movement for an 8-hour workday had grown significantly. On May 1st of that year, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, now 5 years old, called for nationwide strikes wherever the 8-hour day had been refused. Following those May 1st strikes in 1986, anarchist organizers Albert Parsons, remember him from a few minutes ago when I brought him up, and Lucy Parsons led 80,000 people down Chicago's Michigan Avenue in the first modern May Day parade, where they chanted 8-hour day with no cut in pay. I love a good chant. Over the next few days, more than 350,000 workers in nearly 12,000 establishments all over the country went out on strike. In Detroit, 11,000 workers marched in an 8-hour parade. In New York, 25,000 formed a torchlight procession along Broadway, and more than 45,000 went on strike. 32,000 workers took action in Cincinnati. More than 70,000 workers were involved in Chicago. 40,000 strikers and 45,000 workers who were given a shorter working day in order to prevent them from striking. Every railroad in Chicago stopped running, and most of the industries in Chicago were completely paralyzed. The stockyards were closed down. Chicago Mail News outlet published a call to action declaring that Albert Parsons and August Spies, the anarchist leaders of the International Working People's Association in the city, were to be watched. The newspaper said, quote, "Keep them in view. Hold them personally responsible for any trouble that occurs. Make an example of them if trouble occurs," end quote. On May 3rd, a series of events took place, which would put Parsons and Spies in exactly the position that the Chicago Mail had suggested and had wanted, along with the rest of the ruling class. Some of y'all are probably familiar with the events that I am about to bring up, and you can probably guess what we're getting ready to talk about. First, August Spies publishes a statement in the newspaper calling on workers to take up arms. Then a meeting was called for Haymarket Square on the evening of May 4th, and about 3,000 people assembled. It was a quiet meeting, and reportedly, as storm clouds gathered and the hour grew late, the crowd dwindled to a few hundred. Apparently, a detachment of around 180 police officers showed up, advanced on the speaker's platform, ordered the crowd to disperse, to which the speaker argued and insisted that the meeting was almost over. And then a bomb exploded in the midst of the police, wounding 66 policemen, of whom 7 later died. And the police fired into the crowd, killing several people and wounding at least 200. With no evidence on who actually threw the bomb, the police arrested 8 anarchist leaders in Chicago. The evidence against the 8 anarchists was their ideas, their literature. None had been at Haymarket that day, except for Fielden, who had been speaking when the bomb had exploded. But a jury found them guilty, and they were sentenced to death. A year after the trial, 4 of the convicted anarchists, including Albert Parsons, along with August Spies, and Adolf Eicher and George Engel, were hanged. Louis Ling, a 21-year-old carpenter, blew himself up in his cell by exploding a dynamite tube in his mouth. And 3 other anarchist leaders remained in prison. There was a funeral march of 25,000 in Chicago, and the executed anarchist leaders became known as the Haymarket Martyrs. Not that I ever learned about this in school, and you probably didn't either, but Lucy Parsons later co-founded the Industrial Workers of the World, if you're familiar with those awesome folks. And after the death of Albert Parsons and their comrades, she dedicated herself to a life of revolutionary organizing. In the years that followed, May Day became an occasion for protesting the arrests of socialists, anarchists, and unionists, while the authorities locked down even more and initiated the first U.S. Red Scare, shutting down newspapers, closing halls, arresting radicals and unionists nationwide. The government's repression was intended to essentially destroy the radical labor movement that had led to the Haymarket Square incident, and they were pretty successful since their suppression contributed to a decline in a distinctive anarchist influence on the labor movement. But while the immediate result was a suppression of this radical movement, the long-term effect was what actually resulted in keeping alive the class anger of many. It inspired others, especially young people of that generation, to act on behalf of revolutionary causes. 60,000 signed petitions ended up being sent to the new governor of Illinois, John Altgeld, who investigated the facts of the case, denounced the judgment that was made, and pardoned the 3 remaining prisoners. So as much as the ruling class wanted it to be the case, it would seem as if the weight of what had happened at Haymarket Square had not crushed the labor movement. Proponents of the labor movement ran for office and continued to organize across the nation. The year 1886 became known to contemporaries as the year of the Great Uprising of Labor. While from 1881 to 1885, strikes had averaged about 500 each year and involved around 150,000 workers each year, in 1886, by comparison, there were over 1,400 strikes involving 500,000 workers. By 1887, there was a strike of close to 10,000 sugar laborers in the southern fields. 90% of those strikers were black union organizers, and their refusal to work threatened the entire sugar industry. So, martial law was declared in the southern fields, and in a place called Thibodaux in particular, 30 black strikers were killed as a result of the state's violence that was leveraged as a means of suppressing labor efforts. So around this time, the ruling class started to be more careful about the obviousness by which they approached political rule from the perspective of the corporate elite with access to wealth. President Cleveland himself, in his 1887 State of the Union message, included a warning. Quote, "Opportunity for safe, careful, and deliberate reform is now offered, and none of us should be unmindful of a time when an abused and irritated people may insist upon a radical and sweeping rectification of their wrongs." End quote. And because we know that prisons are, in fact, modern-day slave labor, it is important to note that there were also eruptions against the conflict labor system in the South, where prisoners were being leased in slave labor to corporations and were being used to depress not only the general level of wages, but also to break up strikes. It all comes back to the money, right? It all comes back to how do we keep the working class in our control. In the year 1891, miners of the Tennessee Coal Mine Company were asked to sign an ironclad contract, which would require them to pledge against participation in strikes. It would require them to agree to get paid in scrip, and it would require them to give up the right to check the weight of the coal that they mined, which, mind you, they were paid by the weight. So they refused to sign. They were evicted from their houses, and, of course, prisoners were brought in to replace them. So before I move on, if it's not immigrants, it's prisoners, right? Like, they're always pitting us against each other, and they're finding new categories, new means by which to pit each other against one another. Like, you're either a criminal or you're a law-abiding citizen. You're either a citizen or you're not, right? Documented or not. You're either good or bad. Closer to this ideal form of whiteness under white supremacist capitalism, or farther away from it by whatever arbitrary fucking means necessary. So anyways, these miners were asked to sign this contract. They refused to sign. They were evicted from their houses. Prisoners were brought in to replace them. And on the night of October 31st, 1891, 1,000 armed miners took control of the mine area, set 500 prisoners free, and burned down the stockades in which they were being kept. The companies ended up surrendering as a result. They agreed not to use prisoners anymore for slave labor and not to require the ironclad contract. And they agreed to let the miners check on the weight of the coal that they themselves had mined. I need to do, I feel after reading this, I need to do a whole episode on it. So I will probably come back to this later, but my mind is blown. And in the year following 1981, there were even more incidents in Tennessee, which were referred to as insurrections. That year of 1892 saw strike struggles all over the country. Besides the coal miners' strike in Tennessee, there was a general strike in New Orleans that involved half the city's population and completely ceased operations. There was railroad switchman strike in Buffalo, New York, as well as a copper miner strike in Idaho. And ideas of workers' rights and control in the job persisted. And unions that we have talked about in this podcast, like the Western Federation of Miners and the United Mine Workers of America, were radicalized through a number of bloody, violent confrontations with the corporate oligarchs and the government force that was used to protect the profit interest of those oligarchs. And those confrontations ultimately led these unions and these workers' collectives to embrace anti-capitalist ideas and lean into collective organizing. And so, as May Day became associated with the radical left, and as Labor Day was recognized by more and more states, the latter came to be the dominant holiday in the United States, bringing us into the 1890s. The year 1893 saw the biggest economic crisis in the country's history. After several decades of wild industrial growth and financial manipulation and uncontrolled speculation and profiteering, it all collapsed. 642 banks failed and 16,000 businesses closed down. Out of the labor force of 15 million people, 3 million were unemployed. No state government voted for relief, but mass demonstrations all over the country forced city governments to set up soup kitchen and give people work on streets or parks or whatever they could come up with. That depression lasted for years and brought a wave of strikes throughout the country. Massive riots took place in Cleveland, Ohio on May 1st in 1894. And those riots were followed by the largest of strikes that took place at the time. A nationwide strike of railroad workers in 1894 that began at the Pullman Company in Illinois, just outside of Chicago. For those who aren't familiar, which I wasn't, honestly, let's tell the story real quick. The Pullman strike severely disrupted rail traffic in the Midwest, and it all started when the Pullman Palace Car Company lowered wages without lowering rents in the company town. The company town was also called Pullman, and that is now part of Chicago. So wages were already very low, which is not surprising, and workers were already significantly overworked and under-rested, which made railroad work one of the most dangerous jobs in America at the time. Over 2,000 railroad workers were being killed each year, and 30,000 were being injured each year. Despite the working conditions that led to these deaths and injuries, the railroad companies called these deaths and injuries acts of God, or they would blame them on the recklessness and carelessness on the part of the workers. When angry workers complained about gestures vaguely, all of this situation, the owner, George Pullman, had them fired. So they decided to launch a strike. And other workers for the American Railway Union, led by the firebrand activist Eugene V. Debs, joined the action. And so it's funny, I just wanted to note, previously in the 1877 strikes, Debs had actually opposed the strikes, but it was the Depression of 1893 that propelled Eugene Debs into a lifetime of action for unionism and socialism. He had worked on the railroads for 4 years until he was 19, but he left when a friend was killed after falling under a locomotive. The American Railway Union, this is a real tongue twister of an episode, y'all. I'm sorry. Asked its members all over the country not to handle Pullman cars. Since virtually all passenger trains had Pullman cars, this amounted to a boycott of all trains, a nationwide strike. Soon, all traffic on the 24-hour railroad lines leading out of Chicago had come to a halt. Workers derailed freight cars, blocked tracks, pulled engineers off trains if they refused to cooperate. Hundreds of cars were burned by strikers. Tens of thousands of workers walked off the job. Wildcat strikes broke out, and angry crowds, of course, were met with live fire from the authorities. The riots in Ohio, the Pullman strike, it was all culminating in countrywide disruptions and the murders of many workers by police and other mercenaries. And so, it's really not surprising that the 80s and 90s saw bursts of labor insurrection, way more organized than the spontaneous strikes of 1877. There were now revolutionary movements influencing labor struggles. The ideas of socialism affecting labor leaders. Radical literature was appearing, speaking of fundamental changes, of new possibilities for living. In this same period, those who worked on the land, farmers, North and South, black and white, were going far beyond the scattered tenant protests of the pre-Civil War years. And instead, they were creating the greatest movement of agrarian rebellion the country had ever seen, the Farmers' Alliance, an agricultural union that would grow to be more than 400 strong by 1889. In response to the growing crisis of collective organizing and building power among the poor and working class, the government could not simply try to fight off the strikes with their bombs and their guns and their violence and the flexing of their muscles like they had done before and like they would do again in the future. But instead, they had to figure out another more creative way to smother the flames of this spreading fire of revolution. And so, President Grover Cleveland announced that Labor Day in September would become a national holiday. The president co-opted the movement of workers' struggles without affirming the anniversary of the Haymarket incident and the violence of the state that was used to suppress the movement in that moment and in the years that followed. And a bill was signed into law on June 28th, 1894, declaring Labor Day a national holiday. This was around 30 years before the Fair Labor Standards Act would go into effect and actually make any changes in the lives of workers, like related to minimum wage, safety provisions, the 8-hour workday, yada yada. Some historians say that President Cleveland was afraid of losing the support of the working class voters in his re-election campaign. And lest we should forget, the personal is always political, right? While President Cleveland didn't want to lose the support of the working class voters, he also had to protect himself among this rising fear of communist movements that were building momentum in Europe and planting seeds all over America. And so Labor Day was adopted as an alternative to International Workers' Day that was held on May 1st. And in recent days, I'm sure you have in recent decades, not days, excuse me, I'm sure you have observed that Labor Day has been taken over by barbecues, by seasonal sales, by last chance beach vacations. It has nothing to do with labor protests anymore, unless you're here local and you go to the Canton Labor Day parade, which shout out. But more or less, Labor Day has become a tool of corporations to continue to line their pockets and increase their profits while not providing any substantial, but really not any at all, improvements to the lives of the working class and poor folks and the workers who produce those profits on their behalf. So, now we know. Labor Day, coming up just around the corner, is a watered down peace offering that was deemed acceptable to the corporate elites and was used to replace May Day, which was a radical day of demanding power from the ruling class, a day organized by socialists, by anarchists, by unionists, something I had never even heard of before I started researching this episode a few days ago. Who benefits from this stuff being written out of our education system? Who benefits from us not knowing about it? Who benefits from us not demanding power from the ruling class as socialists, as anarchists, as unionists? Who benefits? As you are eating your barbecue this Labor Day holiday, I hope that that's the question that's sitting in your mind. Who's benefiting? Who is benefiting? And with that, I believe we are wrapped up for today's episode of Rednecks Rising. Don't forget to tune in to next week's episode where I will be sitting down with Nelson from Dixieland of the Proletariat. And before we go for today, I gotta know, what is the answer to today's trivia question?
So, the question was, what instrument known from Appalachia was influenced by African culture?
Well, I do believe that it might just be the banjo, Chris.
You're correct. It is the banjo.
Yes, she strikes again. All right, y'all, don't forget that you can head over to our social media pages on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook to follow, support, and share us with your friends. You can also head over to our Ko-Fi page if you feel like throwing some financial contributions our way. And of course, please subscribe on whatever streaming service you listen to your podcasts on and give us a 5-star rating and review if you feel like we are so worthy. And if you feel like we aren't, then please just don't say anything at all. All right, folks, Lord willing and the creek don't rise. I will see y'all next Tuesday with a fresh, hot episode with Dixieland of the Proletariat. Take care, y'all.